Welcome to the Design Build Institute of America's Design Build Delivers podcast. I'm Kim Wright at DBIA's national headquarters. With the summer comes a newfound sense of freedom as our nation appears to be turning a corner on the COVID-19 pandemic. Vaccines have led to a dramatic decline in cases, hospitalizations, and deaths. For the first time since the pandemic began, COVID cases are down in all 50 states. Of course, that means employers nationwide are preparing and implementing return to work plans. But what will they look like? Today, we talk to Stephen Reams, a lawyer and DBIA instructor who's a partner with Smith, Currie Hancock, and also Joshua Holt, who's an associate there. We talk about the changing face of COVID in the workplace, and especially the question, can employers require a vaccine for their workers?
Thanks so much to Stephen and Josh for joining us to talk about all the things that we've seen in the last year plus. When we first talked to Stephen, initially it was really early in the pandemic, I think, wasn't it? It was literally March or April. It was.
We had just gone to a remote work, and I think it was late March, maybe early April.
Yeah, and there were so many things that were up. Nobody knew what to expect. We talked then about all of the challenges and trying to counsel clients about what to do about this and what to do about. I know force majeure was one of the first topics we were all struggling with. But here we are, a year plus later. Give me an idea of what it's been like for the firms that you counsel. How hard has it been for them to get through this stretch?
I'll start, Josh, and then I'll let you come on in with your thoughts on that. It's been very interesting because I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and with the early shutdowns and frankly through all the shutdowns, construction was always deemed an essential service and continued. I don't want to say unabated at all, but it did continue. I didn't see a major breakdown where everybody just canceled projects and pulled out under force majeure events. We certainly saw some disruptions, and we certainly saw some projects get canceled, but at least with my clients, their projects kind of continued at a pace that surprised me.
John?
Yeah, I've had a couple clients just trying to deal with it. So to keep working, but manage the problems. And so, reduced workforce because people have to call out because they're sick or they're exposed and, having to get tested because of the protocols and everything. And so, yeah, trying to manage keeping forward with the work while dealing with the additional stresses.
And I think that's important too, because I think that kind of surprised all of us in the sense that number one, you don't know what to expect. You try to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. And a lot of folks did report that in spite of it all, they were kind of perking along. Maybe not quite what they would hope, but still not as bad as I think a lot of folks had anticipated.
I think that's true. The project management and people who were running the project teams and basically anybody who didn't have to be on site was working remotely. And so we sort of slipped into doing these Zoom meetings and team meetings and all of the various platforms. And it really didn't seem long that people realized, stopped even realizing they were doing anything different. They just started meeting that way. And on project sites, early on, there were implementation of a lot of protocols in order to try to keep workers separated from one another and do the things for social distancing while on site and take up those precautions. But again, I did not see a lot of shutdowns of projects.
We definitely saw safety take on a different twist for sure. Safety was slightly different.
Absolutely, yes.
So today's availability of vaccines is what brings us to a new place. We've now got that beginning sense of normalcy in a lot of situations, but it does present another set of challenges for employers. And specifically, we want to talk about, can employers mandate vaccines for their employees? So let's start with the big picture. There's got to be a number of different agencies and entities that have a say in that, right?
That's true. And Josh has really navigated through that field of the various organizations that would have some sort of say in that. It's interesting because there's so many, and I'll let Josh speak to that, but you have union issues, you have privacy issues, and all of that arises. But I mean, Josh, if someone just said the word "can I," what would you think about where do you need to check to see where you might run into a roadblock?
Right. So you're looking, in addition to the multiple issues, you have multiple layers. So you have the federal level, and then you have state level. You might even have local level. And then, you deal with your kind of specific circumstances. And so you might have contracts or things like that. At the federal level, you're looking at primarily the EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They deal with the discrimination laws, discrimination in the workplace. They came out in December. They updated their guidance on COVID workplace issues to basically say that employers can mandate the vaccine, which was consistent with what they had said about previous vaccines generally, not in pandemic settings. They had a couple of different qualifications, which we can get into more specifically. But the basic takeaway was, yes, you can without running afoul of our laws that we administer. And then the other big one is OSHA, which deals with workplace safety. And interestingly, they've been somewhat quiet on the issue. With the new administration, there was a real push to get them to speak more assertively about COVID generally. And so the Biden administration gave them a March deadline to decide whether they needed emergency standards for COVID. And they blew right past that. It's obviously not an easy task, but apparently they've now put something together and they've submitted it to the Office of Management and Budget for some discussion. So, the general consensus seems to be that that's coming soon. But on vaccines, they've again been somewhat quiet. The sort of overarching rule that everyone talking about this issue that's aware of is that an employer has an obligation to keep its workplace safe for its employees. So that's kind of always in the background. But on vaccines, OSHA has only really said that it's encouraged employers to make the vaccine available. And then in January, they came out with some guidance that said, based on CDC recommendations at the time, that employers should continue practicing all the safety precautions, even for vaccinated employees. So I think that made it so that, at least based on the science at the time, the vaccine wasn't really a silver bullet, because they were still recommending all of the various restrictions. And then obviously you have the CDC. And then, as I mentioned, you have state agencies. So I know in Virginia, there's an occupational and safety administration within the state government that's put out its own regulations. So it's really a patchwork of laws and agencies that need to be consulted on this issue.
Yeah, that's interesting, Josh. You mentioned Virginia, because Virginia was one of the states that came out, which is where Josh is, by the way. It is one of the states that came out early with guidelines for construction projects during the pandemic, during the early days.
Do we expect then is what OSHA is going to provide folks is some little more meat on the bones and specific guidance as to what needs to happen actually physically in a workplace? I mean, what do we expect to hear from them when we finally do hear from them?
It's interesting. I do an amount of OSHA work. I would not. There are people who are just what I would call OSHA lawyers, but we're construction lawyers. But within the construction industry, we wind up doing a certain amount of OSHA work. I did a considerable amount last year, but I'm going to throw this in kind of philosophically, then ask Josh to go down into the weeds on it. But OSHA tends to deal in sort of black and white statements. Like an OSHA, you're not going to pick up an OSHA reg and be reading it for the next hour and a half and then going back and unpacking it. They tend to be, when working above 6 feet, you must have fall protection, period. That's the OSHA standard. we must have fire extinguishers within so many space of a welding operation. They tend to deal like that. And that may present its own challenges with the vaccine. I mean, because they frankly speaking, OSHA probably would, if they were to say we have to have vaccines, they would issue a statement that says all workers working within so many feet of other workers must be vaccinated, period. That would probably, that would be the way I would anticipate an OSHA regulation to come out, not with a tremendous amount of nuance. Now they may issue that statement, then have a number of exceptions and other rules, but they do tend to deal in bullet points, if you would.
And one thing I forgot to add, because it's a recent development after we put together all our research for this topic, is that OSHA, they have a frequently asked questions section on their website, and they just recently updated it. They posed a question of what an employer needed to do with regard to employees who receive the vaccine and then have side effects. And they, sort of to Steve's point, just dealing in black and white, they said, well, if you've mandated the vaccine, then that counts as something you have to report to OSHA if you have employers who take time off or whatnot. And so that kind of threw a wrench into what people saw as sort of the general trend of encouraging vaccination, because obviously that imposes an additional risk for employers that I don't think a lot of people saw coming.
And that's very interesting, because the tracking and reporting itself is an OSHA requirement and an OSHA violation if you fail to do it. So if they mandated the vaccine, you could simultaneously be in a position of having an OSHA requirement to have people vaccinated and then an OSHA requirement to report if somebody had a reaction.
Oh, and doesn't that make your job site personnel happy? All that extra reporting, that's not good news. And I circle back something I thought was interesting too, Josh. Early on, you said, at least I think when talking about the EEOC, we're not really treading completely new territory because they've dealt with vaccine issues before. I hadn't realized that. This all feels so new, and yet I guess not necessarily.
Yeah, it's been an evolving process. And I'd say until this most recent OSHA thing, it's followed, sort of expected course. So there was a lot of discussion at the end of last year when the vaccines were kind of, on the verge of approval, and people started speculating about this mandating issue. And then they came out, and then the EEOC said, yes, generally you can. And the speculation was based on the fact that, years ago they'd put out some guidance on employers mandating other types of vaccines, the typical ones that you would have for school and workplace, that type of thing. And they said, yes, you can mandate those.
So even if employers can implement a mandatory vaccination program, are they? I mean, are we seeing people jumping on that now, or is there some little bit of hesitancy, or we're still trying to figure it out? What are you kind of seeing out there?
I have not seen it in the workplace myself personally, which does not mean it hasn't been done. It just has not filtered to where it has been something that I've either been advised of or consulted on. And I'm going to speculate that with the states trying to encourage vaccination, and some of them, I saw today that, who knows, maybe it was clickbait, but the state of Ohio is going to award 5 vaccinated people each with $1 million through some kind of lottery. So maybe they're going to allow the states to address this at a point where they hope that it is not a problem that they have to worry about mandating. That's purely speculative, and I know that probably isn't the best way to go, but that's how I see that. But Josh, you may have seen something different. I don't know.
No, that's my impression. There's not a lot of hard evidence on it, but I have seen some sort of informal polls from law firms or human resources groups. And it seems like the majority of employers are not mandating. They're maybe encouraging, or in some cases incentivizing, with something like what Steve said. And I think, to what I was saying before about it being kind of an evolving process, is that it was all a little theoretical at the beginning about whether it could be mandated, and then the vaccines came out, and at least initially there was a lot of enthusiasm about it. And so it wasn't necessarily important to mandate it because employees were getting the vaccine. So that may change as that trend kind of trickles down and you get people who want to be vaccinated, fully vaccinated, and then you're dealing with people who are hesitant. That might be where it really kind of kicks in. So that'll be interesting to see.
It definitely does feel like an evolution. I think you're right. I mean, the incentivizing is that trying to get that middle group that just hasn't done it for whatever reason yet before you have to worry about those maybe who are absolutely, totally resistant. Right. Hesitant and resistant are kind of different, right?
Mm-hmm. And I think that when you see mandates, it'll be in the context that you see certain work requirements where you wouldn't come in and say the type of worker who can or can't do a job, but you may say that this job requires that you be able to lift at least 50 pounds, to a height of 5 feet. All right. Well, so we don't say who can have the job. It's open to anyone, but the job requirement is you be able to lift this weight to a height of 5 feet. I can see in that employers looking at a job situation where maybe they have a number of workers in close proximity to one another. And then they would say, to work in this part of our operation, you must be vaccinated. And then they would be able to go back if someone challenged it and say that we're simply stating a work requirement for safety. And that is really throughout history, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad, employers have utilized that approach.
That probably sounds familiar to all of our employers out there. They recognize that for sure. So implementing a mandatory vaccination program, based on what we've already talked about, really isn't a simple "let's just do it" decision for employers. I mean, even if you are wanting to go to that route at some point, there are lots of, like you said, layers and things that have to be looked at, even beyond what we've already talked about. I mean, there are going to be potentially exceptions, right? We've got ADA exceptions, labor exceptions. Run through some of those maybe unexpected or the little nuances if you were really thinking about doing something like this. How are we going to potentially, if we had to mandate all the things that you would have to know to even try to make that happen?
Yeah, I think one of the first, obviously you'd want to make certain that you weren't violating a civil rights rule or law, and then always consider whether or not you have an employment contract or not. As Josh points out in the article, the National Labor Relations Board requires you to notify unions in the event of a change in the workplace. And so if requiring vaccination for a certain job would mean that some union workers would be displaced from that job, at least notification. What that means, I don't know beyond that. I really don't.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so you've got your specific contracts, and then, the EEOC saying that you can, or generally indicating that you can, that's across the board, and they're not speaking to individual employers, individual workforces. So everything we've been talking about, you want to take into consideration the type of work site you have, whether it's whether you have people working in offices, people working out in the field. To Steve's point, what they're doing in those different spaces, how close they are. And then I would say generally you have to know your individual workers too, because you may have a workforce that's fully on board with getting vaccinated, and then you're not going to have a whole lot of problems. On the other hand, if you have a lot of people who are hesitant, then you're kind of rolling the dice, mandating it. And then the two specific sort of big picture issues you have to take into consideration, as Steve was mentioning, are the civil rights laws, which is if you have employees with medical conditions that prevent them from getting vaccinated, you have to take them into account and make accommodations for them. And then people who have religious objections, because vaccination is a pretty hot button issue in that field.
You mentioned Virginia as a state that was, aggressively dealing with, already talking about their state guidelines. We've also had some states that have looking at specifically making it harder to mandate vaccines. So look, it's starting to feel like we were facing that kind of state patchwork approach where every state could be, which was kind of our COVID legacy initially too. So I'm wondering, what does that potentially mean for folks who are trying to navigate this?
That is a harder question. if I were to break it down, if I got this like on a, I haven't been in law school in a very, very long time. If I got a law school question, you had to try to break it down and hit the elements. You would have to think first, are you dealing with a permission from the federal government, but a mandate or prohibition from the state? And does that mean those two laws are in conflict? In the event of a conflict between state and federal law, the victory goes to the federal law. And, so if the federal government simply says you can do it and the state says you can't, is that a conflict? Now, if the federal government says you must do it and the state says you cannot do it, clearly federal government wins. A federal rule or regulation wins in that context. So it becomes a more difficult question to break down what you're dealing with. It'd be hard to imagine a nationwide mandate just because it would almost have to create a new branch of a new bureaucracy within the federal government to deal with that. So you're probably going to be dealing more with the patchwork of agencies having some various positions, but mostly equating to it's okay versus a state full-blown prohibition. And I wouldn't want to speculate on that. It probably is one that may come down to the courts, and so therefore, then you need a plaintiff, an employer who finds it important enough that they want to be able to mandate it, that they're willing to challenge the state regulation. I'm assuming you could also probably have, and I'm not an expert on federal standing for constitutional issues at all, but you might have some public bodies that are in a position to challenge it for, as a general health requirement for the state. They might be able to get standing that way, but probably that's a complication to resolve. And Josh, I don't know what you've thought about that when you run into, if you come down that the federal rules, regulations, and agencies would permit it, what would happen if a state was prohibiting it?
Yeah, I think, and that, maybe provides a little bit of context for why the EEOC kept it somewhat broad and non-committal, is to say, yes, we will open the door to this. And then that allows the states to step in and kind of narrow it or carve out exceptions on their own to kind of fill in that area that the EEOC has allowed. So I think that's right.
Now, if it were to come through as an OSHA mandate, then it would get real interesting, because then you would have a work safety requirement, and that would just say would get real interesting.
Yeah. And actually, that's an interesting point too, because there have been states, like you said, where they've introduced legislation that would prohibit these types of mandates. And they got a lot of pushback from the business community, which maybe was unexpected, because they were caught in a bit of a bind where they have this obligation under OSHA to create a safe workspace. And then they were being told, but you can't do this. And so they were caught in the middle of that push and pull of the different regulations.
And I think Josh is a good point, and it's timely. I was just prior to this call, as part of Josh and my practice, we negotiate and draft a lot of contracts. And I was working on a COVID provision just before I moved to get on this call. And, the contractor's position typically is that pandemic is, if maybe a force majeure event, if not a full-blown force majeure event, at least an excusable delay event. Owners are beginning to look at it like, we've been navigating this issue now for a year. Is this really an unforeseen condition? And then you could have a pretty healthy back and forth about, well, how well is it knowable? And so if the answer to that is vaccine, it would be sort of in both businesses' interests, to the extent that is a protection, to have that vaccine mandate. And therefore, they have less worry, at least, about COVID. It doesn't deal with the supply chain issues, but it does help at least with the personnel issues.
Well, this is a little more on the minutia side, but if you're going to look at requiring vaccines, then it would seem like you also then as an employer are going to have a responsibility to, how much responsibility do you have? Do you need to give them time off? Do you need to pay for it? I mean, there's a practical reality there too, I would think.
Yes, and I think that's going to break down into the should you or must you category. I don't think that an employer would ever be, and I don't want to go that far, it'd be unlikely to say an employer must provide both either the finance for the vaccine or time off for the vaccine. Because if you think about all the other vaccines and health things that you do for work, you typically do them on your own time and even at your own expense. I mean, you've got all your childhood vaccines, and you have undertaken other health requirements for your work. But would they? And my guess is probably yes. If they're going to say that this is what we want every employee to do, that the likelihood is that they would provide it at least the most convenient manner. A great many employers have been offering for decades flu vaccines every year. And so because, a flu is going to disrupt the workforce. And so there's a day when a nurse comes into the office and takes over a conference room and sets up a vaccination site. And so, and typically the employers pay for it, or maybe a nominal charge to the employee to offset some of it. But they do that because they want to encourage the taking of it so that we deal less with the flu.
So in talking about the various things that employers have to think about, and employees too, I mean, obviously I think there's potential privacy concerns here too, as well, right?
Yes, there are. Josh has taken a look at some of those HIPAA issues. Josh, you want to speak on this?
Yeah, I was hoping to avoid the HIPAA, but yeah, I mean, I think actually, so the EEOC focuses, because I'm not sure that HIPAA is all that strongly implicated here, the way this is playing out with a lot of employers suggesting that their employees go get the vaccine on their own, kind of handle it on their own. And that's the way around a lot of the HIPAA things. I think generally speaking, anytime you're dealing with medical information, medical conditions, it just generally is a best practice. It's best to avoid asking too many questions, and what information is shared needs to be protected really closely. The EEOC, the two issues, interestingly, the EEOC flagged weren't HIPAA related. It was that under the ADA and then under what's called the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, employers aren't allowed to ask disability for the ADA or sort of family history, genetic information. They're not allowed to ask those types of questions of their employees. So the question the EEOC dealt with was whether an employer that has a mandatory vaccination program would run into trouble with that. And they said that the act of administering the vaccine doesn't cause any problems, which makes a certain amount of sense. You're just, providing the shot. But of course, in preparation for the shot, there's certain screening questions that have to be asked. So obviously you want to ask someone, do you have a medical condition that's going to create any problems if you receive this vaccine? And that's where you could run into some problems. So again, the EEOC's recommendation was, if you're going to mandate the vaccine, it might be best to leave it to your employees to go get it on their own time, and then just provide proof of vaccination. So maybe the cards that you get when you get vaccinated. And then, that raises the question of paying for it for the time. But I think, to Steve's point, that would be a good way to incentivize the employees to get it, to say, if you get it, we'll pay for your time. And then anyone who's maybe on the fence about it, that might be the incentive they need to take that time.
It's interesting, Josh, that view has been looked at from that angle, because workplaces have historically had blood drives, and at blood drives, they ask invasive medical questions at the work site. And then the other is, you're right, the vaccine itself doesn't really feel like a HIPAA question, and probably isn't. And I don't want to invite anybody to think it is, but if you wouldn't ask someone, have you ever had a certain operation? The fact that you've had the operation, or the fact that you're on a medication ongoing, clearly HIPAA protected. And so I don't think it's that difficult, but there's a little bit of a mental shift then to look at the vaccine and distinguish that from whether you're taking a certain prescribed medicine or not.
Well, I would think even some employers are, as you're making decisions now about, are we coming back out of a remote work environment to come back into the office? It's a natural question to say, how many of you have gotten the vaccine as you're trying to make that decision? But is that even, you have to kind of go, wait a minute, am I even allowed to ask the question?
Yeah. And people ask that question wherever you go, or at least they were when it first hit the streets, because they were curious about, hey, did you get yours also? And so, yeah, you do have to sort of wonder with that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you both for helping us navigate these issues that are evolving, ongoing, complex, multi-layered. It doesn't necessarily, it's different, but it doesn't necessarily seem any easier. So thank you guys for helping us get through all this and helping employers and employees both figure out how to get back to work normally.
Thank you, Kim.
Thank you. It was our pleasure.
Thanks to Stephen and Josh. I also suggest you read their full article on this issue in May's Integration Quarterly magazine. There's no doubt the challenges of this post-COVID recovery era can also bring opportunities. So DBIA will continue to talk about these issues with experts in our industry to help guide our decisions going forward. In fact, we hope you'll plan to join us at the Federal Design Build Symposium in August, just outside DC, and the Design Build Conference and Expo in Denver this November, where we'll bring the nation's best resources and design build expertise together for both in-person and virtual events.